Thanks again for joining us today. I'm Mike Goucher, and welcome to Marquette University Law School, Eckstein Hall. This is On the Issues. This is our series of conversations with newsmakers and people who shape policy, folks who are doing interesting, important work in this region and beyond. And today we are delighted to have with us the new superintendent of the Milwaukee Public Schools, well, sort of new superintendent of the Milwaukee Public Schools. Won't you please welcome Dr. Darienne to Marquette Law School. I said sort of new. She's been on the job for about 4 months now as the permanent MPS superintendent. As the son of a former superintendent, I could say permanent is kind of an interesting word, but 4 months on the job as permanent superintendent. Before that, a few months on the job as acting superintendent. So I guess the first question is, how's it going? How does it feel at this point in your tenure?
I would say, well, first, good afternoon, and it's very encouraging to see so many people here who care about what's happening in MPS, and I think it's a testament to how it's been going. There's been a tremendous amount of support, not only for me, but for our district, for our schools, and most importantly, for our young people. I think we've seen partnership at its best. Just this morning, we were over at Hmong American Peace Academy. They were dedicating their library, and it sounds so small, but there were business people, community leaders, our students and parents who were there gathered from all over Milwaukee to support the school. And I think it's a testament to how special this community is and how much potential there is in our city.
Give me some impressions of this community. You came here in 2012 as the Chief Innovation Officer for MPS. What are we about in your mind as someone who's been here for a couple of years now?
I think Milwaukee is very unique. There are many. Unfortunately, a lot of what you hear about Milwaukee are the bad things, particularly in education, being at the bottom of many of the lists that we would wish to be at the top of. But I think what Milwaukee's about to me is that people who are very committed to a city that may not always have the best break, if you will, but they have a vision and a future for what the city can be. And whether you're talking to business leaders, whether you're talking to parents, whether you're talking to students, there are so many committed individuals to making Milwaukee a better place. Coming here, of course, you always hear about, oh, that's where they shot Happy Days or Laverne and Shirley and all that kind of stuff.
It's hard to live that down. I mean, that
lasts a long time.
Yeah.
But coming here, I think this is just a beautiful place. Yes, this is a segregated city, but there are a number of people who want to make it better. And we do have schools that have challenges, but again, there are a number of people who've come together to try to help us figure out how we can make this a better district. So for me, I think it's a combination of pride that I feel in Milwaukee, of promise, and a good deal of potential.
So, it is a tough job. I mean, that being a big city school superintendent is a tough job. Tenure is not terribly lengthy for many superintendents in big cities. And you touched on a couple of the challenges we face here. We have a lot of poor kids living in our school district here, a lot of them who deal with a lot in their home situations before they even enter the classroom. That's a challenge. And we also have a school situation or environment that features distinct silos, charter schools, voucher schools, public schools. I guess my question is, why is that job appealing to you? Why is this job appealing to you when you look at some of the challenges you face?
Well, for me,
I didn't mean that to really be funny.
After a while, after 7 months, I get that question so frequently, you start to chuckle a little bit. But for me, my grandmother was a teacher, and she always drove home the point that education is the key that can open any door. And my parents really believed in education, and for me, I love school. I love going to school. I love the promise of school. I always had the opportunity to be educated around a diverse group, if you will, and my friends came from all different backgrounds. And so for me, school was so liberating as someone who was shy, as someone who had confidence issues, to be able to go to school and participate in the band and participate in dance programs, but also excel academically, let me know that education really is the liberating force in our country. It's something that I'm so proud of. And so that's what motivates me every day, because I say the same experience that I had as a young person. I want that for all of the students here and all of the students anywhere. And so, yes, it's challenging. There are many days where we don't get a lot of sleep and we have long days, but it's worth it. I mean, if I were to ask people here, tell me about your experiences growing up, everyone is going to have some experience from school. And even if it's just one experience that was positive, that experience can last a lifetime. And so for me, that's what makes it worth it, knowing what education's done for me. The fact that I am the youngest here, it's a testament to if you just stick to it, if you stay focused, you invest in your education, anything really is possible. So for me, that's what drives me.
You are really young. You're 36, is that, if you don't mind me saying?
I am. Feels good to say that. Not every circle people say that's young anymore. I'll take it.
Is youth a virtue here? And by that I mean, we have a lot of people from my generation who come in to run schools, and they bring with them a certain set of experiences, a certain set of knowledge, but sometimes fresh ideas, new voices, youth can be a really good thing. Do you think it's a good thing here?
I do. Being not so far removed from my own experiences growing up or even in graduate school gives me a certain perspective. That it's still fresh in my mind, what school should look like, how it can feel, how it should look. Being a teacher, remembering what it's like to be in the classroom every day. So from that perspective, I think it's a value add. And I think also being able to benefit from people who have been here for a long time. And so it changes the conversation where we start to embrace all generations. So it's not just, baby boomers or Gen Xers or millennials, but it's forcing a very different conversation. And so for me, I think it's really encouraging. And I've learned so much from the people who've been here. And so it changes the conversation. There's no way I can't say, oh, I know it all. I've been there, I've seen it all, because everybody's going to look at me and say, no way. But there are people who have seen a lot. And so it's changing the conversation around what we can bring to the table when we stay focused on the young people. So I do think it's a good thing.
You were a school teacher,
Yes.
Elementary school teacher?
Elementary.
On the east side of Detroit?
Yes.
What did you learn from that experience that you carry with you today that helps you in your role today?
That teaching is rewarding, but very challenging. I take with me the promise of the students that I taught. I remember just taking some young people who were grade levels behind or had issues at home and really getting them to see that education could be such a powerful force for them. I remember the challenges that we faced as a city. I really keep that in my mind a lot. This was 2000 to 2005 when I was in Detroit, and it was right when the car industry started to have its greatest challenges and right before the school district really started to have its challenges. And so for me, just the idea of the challenges of urban districts, change is really the only constant, something that I keep with me, but also that the young people, that is our motivation, that's where our hope comes from, that's our future.
Define success for us now. As you take this job, what does success look like for you with the MPS district?
For me, success looks like all of our young people graduating on time with options, being able to come into Milwaukee proper as productive citizens, whether they go to a 2-year institution or a 4-year institution or directly into the workforce, that they're prepared, that they have the soft skills that are necessary, but also the educational, the knowledge that they need to be successful, that they're able to stay in our city, be able to give back to our city, I think is the greatest reward. I get very excited when I meet people. You're a Marshall graduate, so anytime I hear people who've graduated from Milwaukee Public Schools and they're still here, I think is really the greatest evidence that our school system can work for our young people. So that's one area. I think the other is once the conversation changes from what it is now, where you've got choice versus charter versus traditional public schools, and we spend so much time in that space instead of talking about the potential of our young people. And I think when the conversation starts to really change and it's always about what's best for our kids, to me, would be a huge success and a sign of change in our educational environment.
Do you have metrics that you'll be looking at to determine just how well you're doing on this for graduation rates, for test scores, for all of that? You're going to be setting, I assume, goals in place that you'll want to achieve in a certain period of time?
Yes, so we're in the process now of working through our operational plan. I'm very excited to see one of my board members here, Director Annie Woodward's here today. We just approved moving forward on our operational plan, and basically it's 8 different areas under 3 goals: academic achievement, family and community engagement, and effective and efficient operations. We've broken broken that down into a white paper strategy. So basically working through, what's the problem area, and then how do we start to flush through that to come up with solutions that are going to help our students. Tied to that, we're currently in the process of getting some loaned executives to help us with those metrics. The Council of Great City Schools has just released some academic key performance indicators. So it's everything from third grade reading, eighth grade math, to graduation rates, dropout rates, and things of that nature. But then also looking at us as an organization and really helping us fine-tune specific metrics to help us know whether we're successful. We have a number of different assessments. I'm sure everybody's heard about many assessments that are in our schools. But it's taking all of these different measurements. We're very data rich. But once we've determined what those indicators are, it's really figuring out how to turn them into action so that we have some results to show for the work that's been happening. So we're in the very beginning stages of that. We'll actually have 8 listening sessions for the community in February and March that are aligned to those different areas. So it's everything from re-envisioning our partnerships to workforce development to obviously closing the achievement gap. And from there, then we'll have those metrics that are measurable. People will be able to go online and just see, all the different indicators that we have and know how we're doing.
Candidly, how do you think MPS is doing at this moment in its history?
MPS is in a point of transition, I think, where we've made a number of tough but smart decisions in terms of our finances, making a lot of sacrifices in the area of our benefits to get to the place where we are a financially solvent organization. We have a number of partners, foundations, business, faith-based, who are wrapping their arms around us, so I think that's really a positive. But we're in this really unique place now where all these resources are there. We have to start producing the achievement results. We have to start seeing this in our classrooms. And so there are a number of tools that are coming from the state, everything from educator effectiveness, the Common Core, and all these different pieces. But our challenge now is how do you take all of these resources and coordinate them so we see results? So I think we're at a tipping point right now. We have to be able to produce. There's no question about that. And you say things, what do you take from you? I remember how it felt when we started to get the results in the classroom. I remember how it felt working with turnaround schools in the past. And so I think we are at this tipping point, but I think we're poised and positioned to really start seeing the results in the classroom to match what's happening in our financial structure as well as our operation efficiency.
One of the things that struck me, and I'm not in the field of education, but just as an average person, I'm always struck by the fact that we can have success at urban schools. Reagan, King, German immersion school off the top of my head. These are good schools that are doing really great things in the classroom, and there are a number of those schools at MPS. Maybe we don't talk about them enough. But it seems like we have a hard time replicating that success on a large scale. Do we know why that is? Why haven't we been able to take what works in other schools and make it work in other schools?
I think part of why it's not simple just to take one good program and replicate it somewhere else. We're dealing with students. We're dealing with people. It's quite as simple as just replicating, the cereal tastes great, so we're just going to make more cereal like that. It's really a different process. I think when you're in a city where race and class segregation is so prevalent, and you start to talk about replicating successful programs, we have to take all of those different factors into consideration. And many times we don't hit the mark when we do that. We have some examples like Golda Meir. We were able to expand our Carmen high schools. Now we have a site on the northwest side. But I think it's very complicated when you start to talk about communities. It's just not as simple to just, let's take this program and just move it over here. It really is a much broader conversation. And so I don't think it's, I don't know if undoable is a word, but it is possible. But I think there are a number of factors that we have to take into consideration.
Case by case.
It really is. All students aren't created, every student is unique. All of our schools are unique. And you really do have to look at the nuances for every community, every population that they serve when you start to talk about replicating programs.
One of the things I've heard from other superintendents is that great schools have great principals. Just how important is leadership at your schools in terms of determining its success?
Mission critical. Without a strong principal, there's not too much you're going to be able to do in a school. We've been working very closely this year, and this is actually, I'm proud that this is what I would call a cross-sector conversation, working with our partners from our choice schools as well as charter schools, and how do we recruit and retain the best and the brightest to Milwaukee. We have a leadership framework for leadership, from the State Department now, and we have evaluations for our principals, but it's really We have our monthly institutes that help us frame the conversation around leadership, what makes a good principal, having that vision, being able to bring stakeholders together, caring about students. People underestimate how important that is, to have that true compassion for young people, but also to be able to generate results. And so we just had a meeting with our high school principal this morning, and so much of this conversation is around how do we transfer knowledge of what's working well in one school to another, how do we build our bench. We have assistant principals in most of our schools, and the idea is that you're an assistant principal, then you become a principal, but how do we build that bench? And so the simple answer, it's the linchpin to everything we do in our schools, and our challenge is really getting all of those resources together, whether it's our district, we partner with Schools That Can, we partner with Alverno, Cardinal Stritch, a number of institutions to help us grow our leadership pipeline.
So let's talk about things that are in the news right now, because you described MPS as being at a tipping point of sorts. There are some, particularly in the state legislature right now, who think we have waited too long, that it's time for action. And there are things being talked about right now. You just testified yesterday. We had to move this event a day because Superintendent Driver had to be in Madison testifying about school accountability legislation. You were talking about the Senate bill, but there's also an Assembly bill that has pretty serious sanctions for schools that fail to achieve over a period of time. What's your feeling about these school accountability measures, the idea of giving letter grades to schools and perhaps even having pretty severe sanctions applied if students aren't achieving at a decent rate?
Last April, there was legislation that was passed that helped us with the state report card, and there's 5 different categories that schools fall in. And I would like to see that be able to be given the chance to work before we start into another system. I think the letter grade phenomenon, I've seen it in Florida, and that's something that works there, but it can be very damaging. If you're talking about recruiting the best educators, if you're talking about improving achievement within a school, to have this label, you're a D school, you're an F school, can be very damaging. It's demoralizing for teachers and for students. It turns families away from wanting to be a part of that school. And there's no question that we have to hold our schools accountable, that we have to achieve. But when you start this idea of sanctions, to me, you create this hysteria and really begin to dismantle what public education was designed to do. And that's really give all of our students, regardless of where they go to school, an opportunity to be successful. So I'm not in favor of the sanctions. Again, coming from a place where we had something somewhat similar in Philadelphia, and this was years ago, but just seeing what happens at the school level when you start talking about closing schools and reopening them and the chaos that can cause in a community within and outside of the school, you lose the point. You lose the very thing that you're trying to accomplish in making sure that our students are successful. I think the other piece that's been coming out of these accountability bills has to do with the assessments and making sure that we have, for all of our publicly funded schools, at least one test that's consistent across all of those schools. And again, that's something, cross-sector conversation that we've been having, and how important it is to have at least one assessment that we can all point to. Not only for the apples-to-apples comparison that you'll hear so much of, but it's also being able to, let's say if you're coming in from a choice school, I can go into our student information system and see, okay, this is how you performed on the Badger exam. Now I know where your strengths and your weaknesses are. I know what teacher will be best for you to meet your needs. I know what programs that we can put in place for you. So those are some of the initial thoughts that I have in reactions to that.
Yeah, I was going to say the argument, of course, for letter grades, for instance, is that it's very simple for parents to understand. You know whether or not your child's going to be going to a good school or not. Isn't that helpful to a parent making a decision about where to send their child to school?
Oh, I think any information that we can provide on school performance is helpful to our parents. But we also have a system now that does the very thing that we're talking about in terms of meeting expectations, meeting few expectations, and failing to meet expectations. So again, if we continue to change all of our accountability systems, it's pretty hard to know where you are and where you're going. And so for us, it's really trying to maintain some level of consistency in what was already started last year.
Just as we're talking here, but about 2 hours ago, there was an announcement by Senator Darling and Representative Cuenga. They are Republican lawmakers, both on joint finance, who introduced something that they're calling New Opportunities for Milwaukee, a Milwaukee agenda. It's designed to improve economic opportunities for people who are living in areas of the city with a 10% unemployment rate or higher. But a lot of what they're talking about deals with schools. And one of the things they're talking about is what they call a turnaround school zone. In other words, schools that are failing to meet expectations over a period of time would ultimately end up being perhaps charter schools. There would be a separate board created, probably a locally run board, but it would definitely apply to a number of MPS schools. What's your initial reaction to this idea of a turnaround zone, which some have said is very similar to a recovery school district in New Orleans or Memphis?
I think the idea of having some type of a separate district really gets away from the investment that we should be making in our public schools. I'm not a fan of recovery districts. It's something just on a personal level, being in Detroit, it was years before they became a recovery district, but seeing what kind of devastation that can cause to a community. So for example, if a school closes and reopens as a charter, you have the teachers in that building who have to find new work. You have families who many times will just leave and go to either another city or another district. And you think about the economic impact that can have. If you were to have 50 schools that were to close and reopen, that's thousands of teachers who have to find new work. That's new families, if they pack up and leave, they're all leaving Milwaukee. And many instances, that's what happened, at least I can speak to in Detroit, where, families just started to leave the city en masse. Teachers were leaving the city en masse. And so for me, from that perspective, I think it can be devastating. Another issue is just this whole idea that you close a school and reopen it. We've done that over and over again in MPS over the years, and it doesn't yield the results that people think it does. The type of disruption that it causes in a school, let's say it's January now, but your school's closing in June. What do we think happens between now and June? Nothing. It just becomes this focus on, well, we're about to close, and we just got to make this a good few months. But when you've got that cloud hanging over you, there's no way to really be able to do much that's productive. And so for me, I think that it is a distraction. I think it can cause economic devastation. And then again, this sort of reinventing the wheel. Our high schools are really a place where the need is most. And having seen a number of our high schools, I think everybody here can...
You worked with turnaround schools in Philadelphia, did you not?
I did, and we went to a model where schools that were unsuccessful would close and reopen as charters. Not in mass, it was just a handful at a time. But just seeing what it took to get those schools started, and they still struggled. And I can't speak to where it is now. I don't want to profess that I know what's happening right now, but I remember what it was happening on the front end, and it's not a smooth transition. It goes back to the question that you asked earlier, why can't we just replicate what's working? Where you're talking about students, you're talking about teachers and communities. It's just not that simple, and I feel like we would lose a lot of time moving to that model instead of helping us really put our energy where it needs to be and what's happening on the day-to-day basis with the teachers and our students in the classroom.
The people who, my sense is the people who put together this legislation look to New Orleans and they say, well, if you look at the metrics of New Orleans from 2005 or prior to Katrina and then afterwards when they went to a recovery school district, and many of the schools, in fact, most of the schools are now charter schools. And if you look at what's happened there, the metrics have improved. Graduation rates have gone up, test scores have gone up. Why couldn't that happen in a place like Milwaukee?
New Orleans is a special example because of Hurricane Katrina, where the whole school district was basically wiped out and had to start over again. So I don't know if it's necessarily the same comparison, but what people don't realize, a lot of the families that were displaced, because having lived in Atlanta when we were, families were moving from New Orleans to come there, Houston, my family's in Jackson, Mississippi. We never talk about the disruption and the displacement that happened with all of those families. And so it's easy to say, oh, this is a model that works. We haven't talked about what's happened to the families that have been moved out. And then even being in touch with people who live in New Orleans, they will say that this hasn't generated the results that they thought it would. I think, again, we've got to look at different models to help us support our schools. But just to think you can close a school as a traditional school and reopen it as a charter tomorrow and you're going to get these great results is really misguided. I have 85% of my students living in poverty. We're 86% students of color and 10% that are English language learners. And there are a number of other things that we have to consider in terms of the program, the resources, and the teachers that go into those schools besides just whether or not it's a traditional school or a charter school. And so again, for me, I'm just trying to urge everyone to really think about what are some of the key issues here. It's not just the whether it's a traditional school or a charter school, but it is so much deeper than that. And looking at the programs that we're offering our young people, and then as a city, how are we wrapping our arms around communities and how are we making them thriving? And again, to continue to close public schools and reopen them as charters is not going to yield that result.
Let me ask you about something else that's in the news. This is something you inherited. This is the empty buildings issue in MPS. You've got about, by my count, what, about 17 or so that are empty and a number that are not fully used. What should we do with those buildings?
We've put together a regional development plan that was issued as a communication back in December around the use of our buildings. And so there's sort of 4 different areas that our buildings fall in. Just this month, it's called surplusing, where basically we say we don't need them anymore and we give them to the city for the city to issue out RFPs or lease or do whatever it is they need to do. So we just issued out 6 schools that fall in that category. We also have a plan called Community Cornerstones, and basically it's taking buildings that may not be suitable for schools anymore, but turning them into some type of a lighthouse for the community. So Sherman Park, that was the old Jackie Robinson School, is now housing. We have the Dover project with Teachtown in partnership with, yeah, exactly, it's in the Bayview area. And there's a few others that we've talked about on 37th Street. There's another building we've talked about for housing because it's just not suitable for a school anymore. Another is something that we're called our Spotlight projects. And so this one's the fun one, if you will. So we have Elm, Roosevelt, and Milwaukee High School of the Arts, where we really want to create this global arts campus. And we're partnering with a number of organizations around the city to help us re-envision arts and music in our schools. But again, it becomes this hub, whether it's shared rehearsal space, it's something that the children of the city can participate in, outside of the regular school day, but it becomes this, what we call a spotlight. We also have them for our language programs too. So again, building that pipeline to the School of Languages, we have German immersion, French immersion, Spanish immersion, and how we start to build those programs. And then the last area is really around how do we develop our feeder patterns for our schools. And we want our parents to be able to say, okay, I'm enrolling my child in kindergarten. I already have an idea of where my child's going for middle school and where they're going to go for high school. And so how do we start to re-envision this idea of feeder patterns? Because this is a city of choice. And families, our children are bussed all over the city to be able to participate. But how can we better build our high schools by having some younger grades that are actually feeding into our trade programs, that are feeding into our arts programs or our language programs? So there are a number, it's a communication that was sent to the board. I'll gladly send it to the audience if they're interested. But there is, over time, just a number of ideas to help us with expanding successful programs, building feeder patterns, and then reutilizing spaces that are no longer acceptable as schools.
So this is not a matter, as you've heard some people contend, that MPS is concerned about, and maybe rightfully so, about market share, and that they don't want to willingly give a building to or sell a building to a private school operator because they're competing with them. Mm-hmm. In a sense, you've heard that argument.
Yes,
what do you think of that argument?
For us, it's much more about how do we replicate what we have instead of, sort of keeping folks out. It's really how do we expand what we have within. We have IB programs that are, we have Reagan, we have Rufus King. We want to expand that to the middle school. And so thinking about the city, we're broken into 4 geographic regions. And so how do we make sure in every region, regardless of where students live, they have access to a language program, to an IB program, to a college prep school, to a trade school, to an arts school. And so that's really the vision that we have for this, is how do we reutilize that space. But then also we have a few foundations that are into, now they're exploring adopted neighborhood type of concepts. And so how do we truly make our schools these communities of learning that involve the community around them, that involve putting our families to work through whether it's parent centers or through some type of neighborhood centers. So again, it's not just about, keeping everybody else out. It's really how do we replicate what we have successfully, and how do we create our schools as true communities of learning?
So, some of your job, I think, is fair to say, is the battle for the hearts and minds of Milwaukee residents. You've got to convince them, people nodding in agreement with that, you've got to convince them that MPS is a place that's not just an okay place to send your kid to school, but a place where you really want to send your kid to school. How do you change public perception? Because a lot of it's going to fall on you. Mm-hmm. How do you change public perception about MPS?
you can always show people better than you can tell them. I think the number one way to do that is with results. And until we're at a place where I'm able to spit out 20 metrics that say this is what's working, we're in the process now where it's our brand refresh, if you will. And so a lot of people are like, oh yeah, we saw you on TV, but we're trying to get our kids on TV and just really starting to share the message of what's working well. Partnering, we actually have a firm that's helped us with a lot of our marketing and just telling the good news, if you will, but it's also being transparent about the bad news. I think when people start to get a more balanced perspective of what's happening is when you start to change minds. I also think just come to the schools. Whether you're volunteering, whether you live in the neighborhood, you want to see what's happening, you don't have to have a child in MPS to care about what's happening in the schools. I mean, just look around the room today. There's so many people who really do care about what's happening. Just come and see. A lot of times when people see it, whether they're volunteering, whether they're participating as a mentor or a foundation that's providing some resources to the school, once they see the young people, once they see what's happening in the classrooms, it changes perceptions. So for me, it's just really making sure that MPS is an open door to our community. Everything from what you're going to see or hear in the news, but also what you'll see when you come into our schools, and making sure that everyone knows that invitation is wide open, that we can't do this work in isolation, and we need everyone's help. It's going to take our city to help us turn our schools around. So that's sort of the easy way to say it, but obviously results is what changes the ultimate conversation about how we're doing.
Let me ask you more specifically about the business community, because you mentioned at the beginning of this event that you're trying to build partnerships with business, and yet there are some, and I'm sure you've run into this already. There are some in the business community who have sort of said, I've just kind of moved on. I understand MPS educates a lot of kids, but I'm investing my time, my money, my resources in other forms of education, whether they be voucher schools or whether they be charter schools. And I'm doing that because maybe I'm not happy with the school board, or maybe I'm not happy with the teachers union, or maybe I'm not happy with the level of performance, but I've moved on. How do you bring those people back to the table? Or do you bother trying to bring them back to the table? And you just say, I'm going to look for businesses who still understand the role we play.
In the 7 months now that I've been in this position, whether interim or permanent, I've been very fortunate, actually, that a lot of people are giving us a second look. Some never stopped looking and never stopped supporting. And so whether it's MMAC, Cosby, I'm sorry, I'm using a lot of acronyms.
Metropolitan Association of Commerce,
okay,
Council of Small Business.
Thank you. And Greater Milwaukee Committee, sure. GMC, and also a funders collaborative have really given us the opportunity to come and just talk about what's happening in the schools. And so whether it's a forum like this or a smaller forum, having very transparent conversations about what we're doing with a number of our partners from business, also from foundations and the faith-based community. We're starting to do that as well. And so I think there are a lot of people, our business community sometimes gets a bad rap in terms of how well they support our system. We have countless ways that we are supported, whether it's I keep using acronyms, but the global GPS, and basically it's with Cosby, and what they do is students are able to take classes for 2 hours, they work for 6, and we have that over at Novatech, at James Madison Academic Campus, at Barack Obama School, and at Bradley Tech. And that's a significant partnership where our young people are being put to work. We have the Workforce Investment Board that's coming up with 5 different advisory boards for our young people to be able to engage in. Cosby does the Be the Spark program where our 7th graders, it's a pilot right now, we're trying to expand it, but our 7th graders are able to go to a local business and learn the ins and out of that business as part of our career exploration strategy. And we also have learning journeys. Junior Achievement has been a huge partner for us in 5th grade and 8th grade and getting our young people to learn more about financial literacy, and now we're trying to expand that to our parents. And so there are countless ways, even the 5-in-1 collaborative over at Carver Academy, that's Teach for America, Schools That Can, City or Northwestern Mutual in the district, and how we've all put our resources together to support that school. That came from, like you said, the hearts and minds of a lot of individuals from all sectors, from all walks of life, to be able to create change at the school. So if I can't say anything today, I really want to say when I think about Milwaukee, I do think about the support and the commitment of the people who live here. It's just not celebrated enough, but there really are people who are interested in what's happening to us, who are trying to give us a chance.
Let me ask you 2 final questions, then we'll take some questions from the audience. How much of this is on the parents? How much of the future of MPS rests on parental involvement, parental concern, parental belief that education is the answer?
A large part of our success is in working with our parents and our ability to help engage them in the process that we're doing. Are they the only ones responsible? No. I mean, this is truly a team effort. You know, it takes a village to raise a child. And we do have parent coordinators in all of our schools, but it's also having that conversation. Too often, I think we assume everybody had an experience like us. And we forget that sometimes there are some of our parents who didn't have a positive experience with education or with their K-12 experience, and so we assume that they did and that they're going to be able to do the same thing for their young people. And that's not always the way that it works. And so for us, it's being much more purposeful in how we engage our parents, how we make them feel a part of what's happening at the schools, and then giving them really specific strategies on how they can be a part of their child's learning in the school, but also outside. But I don't see how we do this work without them. I'll tell anybody that asks me, I'm here because of my parents. And their advocacy and what they can't even talk about it, get choked up. But their advocacy and their involvement, and they worked full time. And just thinking about, they would come right after work and change clothes, and they were at the softball game, or they were at the band competition, or they were painting the school, or whatever it took. And so I think the more that we make this real for people, so they understand, it doesn't matter what your circumstances are right now, but here's how you can engage and get involved with your child at school. We're going to help you do it, and then you're going to help us make your child successful. That's got to be the conversation.
I ask that question because sometimes I'll be out talking with folks, and this subject will come up, and I'll say, you know, and I'm a lot older than you are,
Not that.
but yeah, enough, and I will say to people, and I do believe this, and I could be 100% wrong, but I'll say to people that I think in some respects we've lost our way. When I was growing up, kids knew that education was the way to achieve big dreams. That they just knew it. It was stressed in the home. It was stressed societally. And I wonder if we do that now. As a younger educator, do you ever worry that maybe we don't stress the right things, that kids aren't being told time and time again that, yes, education is the answer? I almost feel like sometimes there's a pressure not to succeed in our society.
This is a really interesting question for me because I also struggle with the relevance of education. So when you talk about getting our young people to come every day, and if you do everything your teacher tells you to do, and you do well on these tests, and you know you're going to be successful, and our young people don't buy it. There's not enough evidence that investing in our education is going to yield some type of positive result. So I think in many ways education has lost its relevance. This is the age of information, and so the world is at their fingertips. And so before we were kind of able to control the message and say, okay, well, this could be the only pathway for you to be successful. And now, you know, our young people are saying, oh, actually, there's other ways that we can do this. And so it really is I feel this competition with the technology and with, you know, all this information, the fact that this is a global society, and how do we remind them of the simple things that can help them get to where they're going. I think another piece, and my father says this all the time, because he grew up during the civil rights movement, and he participated in sit-ins and things like that when he was in college. And so he always says, you know, we made it and then we forgot. You know, and once we were able to get through, you know, those times, and we felt like we were successful because we had good jobs, and so we just packed our things and we moved out, and just kind of forgot that we still had an obligation to our community. And so, like you said, as sitting in the seat that I'm in now, I think about that more often than I probably admit. Not only where did we get lost, but how do we make learning relevant? And then how do we convince people, I mean, just like yourself, you were born here, you're still contributing to your community every day. How do we convince everybody that it doesn't stop, you know, at 12th grade? Education's lifelong. How do we reinforce that in everything that we say and do? And then how do we, you know, sort of this idea of giving back, you know, it's more than a notion, it's what it's going to take to get education back at the forefront.
All right, well, I'll take some questions from the audience. Please raise your hand. No speeches, just brief questions if you would.
Okay.
That's okay. Let me start down here and I'll move up. Yes, go ahead, please. Just hold down on the rim there. I think you know how to do that.
When you talk about optics, the common person on the street looks at MPS and thinks of two things: disruptive classrooms and truancy. Can you address how you're going to change not only that perception, but the fact that there's an astonishing number of kids who miss school on a regular basis, and teachers often complain they can't control their classrooms without assistance?
A big part of this, we're actually in a partnership now with Panasonic Foundation can I keep talking?
Yeah,
Okay.
that's fine. Absolutely.
In partnership with the Panasonic Foundation, they're coming to do an equity study for us. They'll be here for about 2 weeks in March, just whether it's going and doing observations in our classrooms, but also coming to central office and seeing how we're structured. And I started with that because part of this is around culturally relevant teaching practices. We underestimate how challenging it is for our students and our teachers to be able to relate to each other because we do live in a city where we are segregated, and so we forget that we need tools to be able to figure out how to work together. So in terms of the classroom environment, that's a large part of it. We have our educator effectiveness framework that's also giving us real tools and strategies on how you start to have those conversations with our young people, how we better engage them, how we better understand them. We're starting to explore and expand this concept of restorative practices, and so it's a reflective process. And I'll be honest, I mean, I used to think it was fluffy, but I'm starting to really understand that it has much more value, and young people start to own their behavior, start to think through, okay, this is how I can do things differently, and they do it together, as a group, so it's sort of this near-peer support. In terms of truancy, we have what we call our student safety nets framework. It's everything from a partnership with the police department to what we call our sort of a case management model in the way that we support our students. We also have I just was going to say what it is, like a SWAT team of attendance officers now who are really trying to help us get to the bottom of why young people aren't going to school. There are so many different issues that affect our young folks on a day-to-day basis. The beginning of January, I'm sure everybody remembers we had to close school for a few days, but our attendance was really staggering that whole week because it was just so cold. And so whether it's getting the outerwear that our young people need, that's sometimes a reason. Life circumstances can be a reason. And sometimes school just isn't engaging. And so, again, looking at the relationship with the teachers, how do we create an environment that's significantly more engaging for our young people, but then the partnerships that is in really looking at the data with why aren't they coming, okay, then how do we get here? And so, trust me when I say it's really, a team approach to trying to get our young people to come back to school on a day-to-day basis. Thank you.
Quick question.
There's a problem in all the schools and more in the inner city schools than in the suburban schools. You mentioned issues at home, you mentioned problem areas, you mentioned turnaround zones. How are we going to get the legislators to understand when you look at the effectiveness of a school? And so many of the kids in certain schools are falling asleep in school because of the problems at home. Has nothing to do with the teacher, has nothing to do with the principals. The kids are coming to school to sleep because they can't sleep at home, they can't do the homework at home. How do we get the legislators in Madison to stop with this report card system and not take that into effect?
So one strategy, and I don't know if it's a strategy or just something that we're trying to do, this is so much bigger than Milwaukee. And I think for so long this has been labeled as a Milwaukee problem. And so now I'm talking with Madison, Green Bay, Kenosha, Racine, even Waukesha. All of us are affected by this idea of sanctions, and all of us have similar demographics and similar challenges. And so how do we start to speak in a collective voice when we're working with our legislators? I think another piece, we do a lot of, whether it's one-on-one meetings, whether it's testifying, but just really giving an outline of the challenges that we have, but also showing that we do have strategies to work through them, but we need their support to do that. And I think some of that is reflected in what you would see in the Senate Bill 1. There were a number of drop-in sessions, if you will, in meetings with educators, not only in southeastern Wisconsin, but in different parts of the states to help to get to that place. And I think it's just going to take more of that. The conversation can't only happen in January. This really is something year-round that we have to really engage in what's happening in the schools. But I do think having everybody understand that this is broader than Milwaukee is really important. We also have partnerships around the country. The Council of the Great City Schools is also trying to help us think through some of this. We have legislative days in March where, all the urban superintendents from around the country go to DC. And it's this very thing. How do we start to speak in a collective voice with the challenges that are affecting our urban school districts? And as opposed to just sort of being the only urban in the state, there really are other districts in Wisconsin and around the country that are having the same issues.
Let me take other questions. I can go right here. Yes, sir. Press down on the, hold down on the rim.
I retired recently from an organization called Milwaukee Urban Gardens, a small nonprofit. I would get teachers calling me all the time asking, how can I start a garden I can teach math, I can teach reading, I can teach arithmetic, and it engages the kids. It's an activity. And there were a whole variety of roadblocks that came up, from the principals to finding the land, finding the resources, to the teachers knowing how to teach with it. But I've heard over and over teachers saying this would be a great way to engage our kids. Do you have some thoughts on how we could get some more urban agriculture and local food in our schools?
Well, that's an interesting thing because, as you know, Will Allen and other people here have done a lot of things, growing power. Is that something that the schools play a role in or could play a role in?
It is. So we actually have 5 schools this year that are piloting what's called systems thinking in schools. It's designed in partnership with the Waters Foundation and with Peter Senge, and it's this whole idea of schools as the learning community. A big part of that is the environment and really looking at the schools as the ecosystem as part of the city. One of the schools, Brown Street, actually has a garden. The Rotary has played a large part in helping to grow that garden. These schools also partner with the Urban Ecology Center. And so it's giving us a very different perspective on the learning experience and the learning environment. But again, things that I think are really important. I grew up in Virginia Beach, right on the water. And so I just remember everything was about, the marina and wildlife and in the ocean. And, I think it's the same thing that we have to create here. Agriculture, you talk about what's Milwaukee. Agriculture, the local food. I mean, it's such a mainstay for our community. So it's something I get really excited about. Again, we've got 5 schools that are sort of pioneering this, but between the Growing Power, like you said, the Sweetwater down on the south side, and even Alice's Garden that works specifically in the inner city, I think we will see much more of this happening in our schools. And so, again, trying to create these vehicles to be able to communicate with us all these great ideas. And so I'm hoping when we start the listening sessions in February and March, we'll be able to start hearing some of this. But right now we're starting with 5 schools. I'm hoping to grow it larger.
Okay. Other questions? Yes, sir. Down on the rim.
I'll try to speak loud.
No, we got you.
Okay.
In a leadership position such as yours, how can you deal with a psychopath when termination is not an option for various reasons?
I bet you were not expecting that question.
Well, we do have a process that we use for educators I guess I don't have enough details to really answer your question the way I should, but we do have a process, whether it's an emergency misconduct or things of that nature, to help when we do have teachers or educators that are not fit for the environment that they're working in anymore. But again, I think the other piece, prayer does a lot of things. I think having community partnership, it does. And I think having community partners that wrap their arms around the system, I'm not naive enough to think that I can do this by myself. And so it's important to have allies and alliances, but also being able to tap into, there's so many familiar faces here because these are people I've seen in schools, that I've seen in the community that are trying to help us figure this thing out. And so that's your armor that you carry with you. So when you do have some instances where someone might be irrational or, like you said, a psychopath, there's some buffers, but also some strategies that you can use to help with those situations.
Speaking of familiar faces, Sister Joelle, you had a question?
Among the innovations, you were asked by Mike, have we lost our way? We don't think about it. Sometimes I think it's just the structure of education. We've got everybody, first grade, second grade, third grade. It corresponds to very little. Some kids are in 4th grade, but they ought to be in 2nd grade. So have you ever considered what's called an ungraded school? Unfortunately, that term usually turns into people's argument. That means you're not giving any evaluation. It has nothing to do with that. It deals with the kind of thing you were talking about, engaging the child at the level they need the engagement. It would solve a lot of problems. I've seen those ungraded schools, and they work. Mm-hmm. So is that one of the innovations, the structure of schools? When you talk about what looks like success. Success in a school like that is very different from success in this grade level where you just go by tests and move them on.
So one of the things that I tell my team all the time is there's no such thing as a bad idea. And so my experience in working with sort of this ungraded concept is on a much smaller scale. We used to do something called intervention blocks, but it was for acceleration and enrichment, as well as for students on grade level and then for students who were below grade level. And it was about 2 hours every day, and the students, everyone just sort of mixed up. Teachers weren't teaching their regular grades. It, you know, it was sort of a I guess, like you said, sort of an ungraded environment. I'm very open to it. Again, I think that we have to look at a number of different models if we're going to figure out what's working well. Not, you know, experimentation per se, but I think it is worthwhile looking at. Case in point, we have 5 K-12 schools, and while it's a model that can yield so many different benefits, it is really challenging, even thinking about how you staff it, how we send different resources to that school. So I think that could be something. Oh, and I'm not disagreeing with you. So this is, I'm kind of excited just listening to it, because I think it's something that would be worthwhile to look into.
Any questions? Here's a young guy over here, yeah, go ahead.
Thank you. This was very enjoyable today. Thank you. One part that troubled me was when you talked about replication of successful public schools. You basically said that it was situational and hard, which is true, but doesn't seem impossible to overcome. So can you talk about the process of the successful Golda Meir and Carmen expansion? So even if schools can't replicate the specifics in the school, they can at least replicate the successful process they undertook?
We're in the process, we have a decision matrix that we use, and so it's everything from, we ask a series of different questions, and so I feel like this is going out, I'm sorry, okay. It's everything from space availability, is there demand for the program? Do we have some evidence that the program works? And then starting to piece together a timeline for implementation. It involves a number of different community input sessions, for lack of a better term, meetings with parents, with staff, with community partners on what an expansion could look like, whether it's growing grades or whether it's trying to take the same model like a K-8 school and sort of putting it in another place. But that's what makes it situational. So it's not that it's impossible, but you can't just say, all right, we're going to make every school a K-12 in this district, because my K-12 principals will say this is a very challenging model. And so just being very thoughtful and deliberate about how we do that. But there's actually about, I would say, 7 different steps that we take before we even decide whether or not a school needs to be, where we want to replicate a school, and then is it feasible? And we try to make sure we have all of that mapped out before we just move out and say, okay, we're going to replicate this program.
Okay. Yes, sir.
One of my problems with the grading system is it basically is backward looking. And it kind of encourages excuses for why we weren't successful as we might have been. What I'd be much more interested in is what are we going to do about it going forward? We know, let's say hypothetically, here's an F school. That doesn't mean shut it down. To me, that means, and again, the grade will screw everything up. Forget. What are we going to do with this school going forward to make it a successful one? Where's the action plan? Which would come from, I would think, the principal and the teachers.
Yes. So some of what we started is our Commitment Schools initiative this year. It's 14 schools. And all of this was around the school team and the community coming together and mapping out a plan for how we start to turn around the situation that's at the school. And so when you start to think about, what are we doing about it, it's been a little bit of everything. Let's just specifically stick with the high school. So one high school in particular has a community partner. We're actually working with United Way to bring in a community coordinator to help with some of the social and emotional problems that are in the school, partnering with local universities to help us with the curriculum design, and hopefully if everyone's able to take community college courses for free, really how do you start to think not only K-12 but K-14, and giving young people those opportunities to take those courses. I think another big piece for us is, and someone mentioned it earlier, if you've got students that are behind grade level, what are we doing to help accelerate them to get them on grade level? And so it's really looking at literacy across the curriculum, and how do we start to incorporate reading strategies into social studies and science courses to help get our young people back on track and then obviously accelerate them. But it really is a school-by-school basis. One of the things we're doing with our budget process, when the schools start in March, we've already gone through a lot of our operational planning. And so really it's taking every school, starting to look at our students from when they come to 9th grade to 12th grade and start mapping out we call them academic success plans, but it really is looking student by student, school by school to come up with what we think can work. But again, it's not something that's done in isolation. We don't just go in the district office and make this up. It really has to be a partnership with the school and the community around the school.
Maybe a brief final question. Yes.
Dr. Driver, my wife and I worked in suburban schools.
Carl's a former superintendent in MEC1.
Oh, okay, nice to meet you.
And I'm sitting here wondering, with the talented people that are there, just as you have talented people, are there things that people that are in the suburbs, in education, might do that would help you in your endeavor?
There are a number of collaboratives across districts. I hate to keep using the word collaborative, but that's, we're education, that's what we do. But working across different districts to start strategizing. A big area for us is around human resources. Knowing that enrollment is down in teacher preparation programs around the country. Enrollment's even down in Teach for America now. And so how do we start to think about, the metropolitan Milwaukee in terms of being able to recruit and retain the best and brightest? So that involves a number of the deans from the education schools, as well as all of the human resources directors actually get together. I forget their acronym, but they get together on a monthly basis to start strategizing around this. That's kind of the easier, I hate to say easier, but that's the one that brings people together the easiest. Had a few conversations with some of our superintendents from around, it's CISA #1. It's basically the education collaborative group with superintendents from around southeastern Wisconsin, and coming together around specific issues of educator effectiveness. Curriculum design is always a lot more complicated because just curriculum in itself is so complex, but those conversations are starting. But I think, again, it's easy when it's 40 people in a room, but when you really start to get those key strategies that you can take back to your district is when it is that one-on-one conversation. My coming in, I'm not the only new superintendent. There are a lot of new superintendents now. And so all of us are, sponges trying to figure out what are they doing in other places. So again, when you say that tipping point, this really is a chance for us to think differently about how we're delivering education to the young people in Wisconsin.
Thanks for the question, Carl. I'm going to wrap things up there. Before we say thank you to Dr. Driver, just a couple of reminders about future On the Issues events. February 5th, I think that's next Thursday. It's an interesting event that's designed in part with our Mission Week here at Marquette. I'll be talking with Vanessa Tobin. She is a water expert for Catholic Relief Services. And, I think we get a little spoiled with living on the Great Lakes. We just take water for granted. It is not something to be taken for granted. In fact, it is a very big issue in many respects around the world, and Vanessa Tobin has traveled around the world, worked around the world, and she'll talk about water as a global issue next Thursday. And then on February 9th at 4 p.m., special time, don't know if we have any seats still available, but Congressman Paul Ryan will be here with us on the 9th. Again, we want to say thank you for your interest, your attention today, and most of all, our thanks to Dr. Darienne Driver. Thank you very much.